I wasn't looking for the Sphinx when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane. The administrative record of the French expedition to Egypt in 1798, specifically the engineering surveys conducted under Napoleon's scientific commission, the description de l'Egypte. I was looking for discrepancies in how the French measured the Nile floodplains, trying to understand why their calculations never matched the British colonial surveys that came later. That was the rabbit hole I had entered. That was the thread I was pulling. And then, buried inside the third volume of the expedition's geological appendix, a section that almost no one reads because it deals with limestone strata and erosion tables, I found something that stopped me completely. A French geologist named Edmé-François Jamard had written, in careful academic French, that the weathering patterns on the lower body of the Great Sphinx were inconsistent with sand abrasion. He wasn't making a bold claim. He was doing what geologists do. He was recording what he observed. But what he observed directly contradicted the Egyptian chronology that was already being constructed around him by Egyptologists who had already decided what they would find before they found it. Jamard's notes were incorporated into the description de l'Egypte, published, catalogued, and then quietly ignored for over a century. When I read his words, I understood why. Because Jamard was right about what he saw on that limestone, then almost everything we think we know about when the Sphinx was built and who built it begins to fall apart. That is the moment, sitting in a library with a scanned 19th century document on my screen, when the official explanations began to collapse. The Sphinx sits at the edge of the Giza Plateau in Egypt, approximately 30 kilometers southwest of modern Cairo. Its body measures 73 meters in length and 20 meters in height. Its face looks east, toward the rising sun, and it has looked east, according to Orthodox Egyptology, since approximately 2500 BCE, during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. That is the official answer. That is what every museum placard says, what every textbook prints, what every documentary narrated by a reassuring voice tells you. I spent years accepting that answer without question. Most people do. But here's a problem that Jamard noticed in 1799, and that a geologist named Robert Schoch confirmed with far more sophisticated tools in 1990, and again in 1992. The erosion on the Sphinx enclosure, the pit carved into the Giza Plateau from which the Sphinx itself was hewn, is not the product of sand erosion. Sand erosion produces horizontal striations. It scours and smooths in lateral patterns consistent with wind-driven abrasion. What the Sphinx enclosure shows instead is vertical weathering. Deep, rounded undulations carved into the limestone walls by water, specifically by precipitation, by rain, not a little rain, substantial, sustained, repeated rainfall over a very long period of time. Here is why that matters. The Sahara has been hyperarid, bone dry, for approximately 5,000 years. The last period of sustained rainfall in the Giza region, what climatologists call the African humid period, ended roughly around 5000 to 3500 BCE. If the Sphinx was built during Khafre's reign in 2500 BCE, as orthodoxy insists, then it could not have been weathered by rain. There simply wasn't enough rain at that time to produce what we see on those limestone walls today. Robert Schoch, a professor of geology at Boston University, a man with no particular axe to grind, no alternative history agenda, published his findings in peer-reviewed geological literature. His conclusion was careful, conservative, and methodologically rigorous. The Sphinx enclosure showed weathering patterns consistent with heavy precipitation, suggesting the monument was carved no later than 5000 BCE, and possibly as far back as 7000 to 10,000 BCE. The photographs in Schoch's published work are extraordinary to examine. The grain of the limestone walls in the enclosure shows rounded, flowing erosion profiles, not the sharp, angular cuts you see on monuments built in the dynastic period. I obtained copies of comparative analysis he conducted alongside Egyptologist Mark Lehner, who was brought in specifically to provide the counterargument. The Egyptologist responded not with geological data, but with incredulity. Lehner's argument, stripped to its essentials, was that the geological evidence couldn't be right because it contradicted the historical record. You'll notice what that argument is missing. It is missing geology. The shadows fell correctly across Schoch's analysis. The grain matched the weathering models. The erosion profile predated the technology, or rather, the civilization available to fake it. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What stopped me from filing the Sphinx away as an isolated anomaly was the moment I began mapping comparable structures. Because the Sphinx is not alone. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across continents and centuries, and once you begin to follow it, it does not stop. In Pumapunku, near Tiwanaku in Bolivia, at an elevation of roughly 3,800 meters above sea level, there are stone blocks weighing between 130 and 800 metric tons. Precision cut with geometric accuracy that current engineers describe as extraordinary. The H-blocks at Pumapunku feature identical interlocking grooves, cut to tolerances of less than a millimeter in andesite, one of the hardest stones on Earth. The orthodox date for Tiwanaku civilization is approximately 300 to 900 CE, but the geological substrate beneath Pumapunku shows water erosion patterns similar to those shock identified at Giza, patterns inconsistent with the aridity of the Bolivian Altiplano in the last 2,000 years. Move now to Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Sanliurfa. Here, excavated beginning in 1994 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, are circular stone enclosures with T-shaped limestone pillars standing up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons. The site was deliberately buried, filled in approximately 10,000 years ago by whoever built it. The orthodox date places its construction around 9,600 BCE. That date is accepted by mainstream archaeology and already demolishes the standard timeline of human civilization because 9,600 BCE is before agriculture, before cities, before writing. Someone built a sophisticated ritualistic complex of enormous stone before, according to the textbooks, they have figured out how to farm wheat. Who were they building it for? In Baalbek, Lebanon, the ancient city contains what are called the Trilithon stones, 3 limestone blocks embedded in the western retaining wall, each measuring approximately 19 meters in length, 4 meters in height, and 3 meters in width, weighing an estimated 800 to 1,000 tons each. These are among the largest stones ever incorporated into a building anywhere on Earth. The Romans built the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek. They did not cut the Trilithon stones. Roman engineers, writing about their own construction projects with meticulous pride, made no mention of moving stones anywhere near that size. The Trilithon stones were already there when the Romans arrived. From Delhi to St. Petersburg, from Buenos Aires to the ancient sites of the Indian subcontinent at Ellora and Elephanta, the same signature appears. Scale that defies conventional explanation, precision that defies conventional tools, and weathering that defies conventional dating. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, and the question that pattern forces is always the same one. Who were they built for? In the cartographic archives of the 17th and 18th centuries, in maps housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, in the map collections of the British Library in London, and in imperial survey records held in St. Petersburg, there is a name that appears consistently across European cartography for nearly 300 years, and then vanishes with thoroughness that is, in itself, remarkable. The name is Tartaria, or, in its more formal rendering, Tartary. Not a legend, not a myth, not a marginal annotation by a confused cartographer. Tartaria appears on maps produced by Guillaume de Lisle in 1706, by Johann Baptist Homan in 1730, by the British cartographer Thomas Kitchen in 1787. It appears in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the first edition, published in 1771, where it is described as the largest country in the world by land area, larger than China, larger than the Russian Empire, an empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast of Asia. And then it stops, not conquered in a decisive war, though wars occurred at its edges, not renamed through a gradual process of cultural assimilation, not absorbed slowly into neighboring empires. Between approximately 1800 and 1860, Tartaria disappears from maps, from encyclopedias, from formal historical discourse, with a speed and completeness that is, by any measure of historical change, anomalous. When empires fall, they leave ruins, records, refugee populations, successor states, oral traditions, material culture. The Roman Empire fell across centuries and left us everything: law, language, architecture, literature, Religious institutions. Tartaria, the largest country in the world according to an 18th century encyclopedia, left almost nothing in the official record. Almost nothing that has been permitted to remain. Now here is where the connection to the Sphinx becomes impossible to ignore, because among the alternative cartographic traditions, the maps that circulated outside of European imperial sponsorship, the surveys conducted by independent scholars and merchants along the Silk Road, the Great Plateau civilizations associated with what cartographers called Grand Tartary are consistently described as the inheritors of much older architectural and astronomical tradition, a tradition that did not originate in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but that predated both. The precision stone construction at Pumapunku, the water-weathered enclosure of the Giza Sphinx, the T-pillars of Göbekli Tepe. These are not independent cultural inventions. The evidence points to a single-parent tradition that the official record has been carefully, systematically arranged to make invisible. The 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of extraordinary archaeological discovery, and the popular press of the time documented it with thoroughness that the Academy has since largely set aside. I have spent considerable time in newspaper archives, both physical collections and the digitized records now held by institutions, including the Library of Congress and the British Newspaper Archive, and what I found there tells a story that the textbooks do not. The Cairo Illustrated News, 1889, a correspondent covering the ongoing clearance work around the Sphinx, reports that workers employed by the Egyptian Antiquities Service uncovered, at a depth of approximately 4 meters below the monument's southern flank, a series of cut stone channels exhibiting what the correspondent describes as a degree of finish inconsistent with the tools available to ancient Egyptians as currently understood. The channels were documented, photographed, and reported. The photographs were submitted to the Antiquities Service. They do not appear in the subsequent official publications of the clearance project. The Philadelphia Inquirer, September 14, 1897, a report from a contributor in Alexandria, describes correspondence with a French engineer named Devereux, who had been conducting private surveys of the Giza Plateau with theodolite equipment. Devereux claimed to have identified a geometric relationship between the Sphinx, the 3 main pyramids, and a series of underground limestone formations that align precisely with the constellation of Orion as it appeared in the sky around 10,500 BC, a date that corresponded, he noted, with the water erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure. The article ran once. There was no follow-up report. The Times of London, March 3, 1909, a brief notice of a paper delivered to the Royal Geographical Society by a retired colonial surveyor named Ashworth, who spent 15 years in Egypt and had cross-referenced the construction mathematics of the Giza complex with construction mathematics from sites in the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and the Anatolian highlands. Ashworth's claim was that the same modular unit of measurement, a length he called the primordial cubit, differing from the standard Egyptian cubit by approximately 3%, appeared in all of these sites. The Royal Geographical Society published a summary of the evening's proceedings. Ashworth's paper was not included. Scientific American, 1913. A brief correspondence column entry from a geologist at Columbia University questioning the standard erosion dating of the Sphinx and requesting that the American Institute of Architects formally commission an independent geological survey of the monument. The letter was published. The survey was never commissioned. The New York Herald, 1921. One of the last major newspaper articles I can find that treats the anomalous weathering of the Sphinx as an open question deserving investigation. After 1921, the tone shifts. After 1921, the articles that appear are not investigative. They are declarative. The Sphinx was built by Kaffer. The date is 2500 BC. The questions that had circulated in the press for 30 years simply stopped being asked. The photographs stop. The reports stop. The maps change. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence carefully. What if the Sphinx and the complex of structures associated with it at Giza and the broader pattern of anomalously precise ancient construction that appears on every inhabited continent is not the product of Egyptian civilization, but is instead the surviving physical remnant of a predecessor civilization that ended catastrophically, that the civilizations we call ancient inherited without fully understanding, and that the institutional history of the last 2 centuries has been organized, consciously or unconsciously, to prevent us from examining too closely? I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming alien intervention. I am not claiming lost magic. I am claiming something far more unsettling in its ordinariness, that a sophisticated human civilization existed before the period we call prehistory, that it possessed knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, hydraulic engineering, and material science that we're only now recovering, and that this civilization was destroyed, possibly by the same catastrophic climate shift that ended the African humid period around 5000 BCE, possibly by events we have not yet fully reconstructed, and that what survived of its physical legacy was inherited by successor cultures who could use these structures without understanding how they had been built. Why would this be erased? Consider the political architecture of the 19th century. European colonial powers were in the process of constructing a narrative of civilizational hierarchy that justified their global dominance. That narrative required the ancient world to be explicable, containable, and sequential. Egypt gave way to Greece. Greece gave way to Rome. Rome gave way to Christian Europe. Christian Europe gave way to industrial modernity. A pre-Egyptian builder civilization of global reach, with capabilities that 19th century engineers would have struggled to replicate, was not merely an academic inconvenience. It was a foundational threat to the entire story. If the builders of the Sphinx were not the Egyptians we know, then who were they? And if the answer to that question cannot be contained within the accepted civilizational sequence, then the sequence itself must be protected at any cost. Why does the evidence keep returning us to the same dates, the same window between 700 and 10,000 BCE? Why do the geological signatures align across continents? Why does every culture with a flood myth place the Great Catastrophe in precisely that period? What I find most instructive is not the evidence itself. Evidence can be disputed, reinterpreted, explained away with sufficient creativity. What I find most instructive is the institutional response to the evidence. Because when Robert Schoch presented his geological findings to the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in 1992, not to a fringe conference, not to an alternative history convention, but professional geologists who were entirely competent to evaluate his methodology, his work was received with serious attention. The geologists did not dismiss it. They engaged with it. Several expressed agreement. Several expressed a desire for further study. It was the Egyptologists who dismissed it. It was the historians who refused to engage. And they didn't debate. They didn't publish refutations with competing data. They simply declared the question closed and excluded it from the serious literature. It's not active suppression in the dramatic sense. No one is confiscating documents or silencing researchers through threat. It's passive erasure. It operates through mechanisms that academic institutions have always used to enforce consensus. Peer review committees that decline to forward heterodox papers, grant bodies that do not fund research into questions the field considers settled, museum curators who label anomalous artifacts with confident dates and provide no mechanism for challenge, textbook publishers who write for the curriculum as it exists and not for the evidence as it accumulates. The system does not need to be conspiratorial to be effective. It needs only to be self-reinforcing. I have spoken with independent researchers who have attempted to raise the water erosion question in formal academic contexts. The response they describe follows a consistent pattern that I have now encountered enough times to recognize it as institutional rather than individual. First, the question is reframed as a matter of established consensus. You are not raising evidence. You're displaying ignorance of the settled literature. Second, the questioner is associated, explicitly or implicitly, with fringe movements that have no credibility, as if the geological evidence changes character depending on who cites it. Third, the specific evidence is never addressed directly. The pattern appears across disciplines, across countries, across the span of the last century and a half. And what it produces is a kind of intellectual no man's land around certain questions. Questions that the evidence demands we ask, and that the institutions have quietly agreed we will not. There is one more category of evidence that I keep returning to, because it sits in a place where it cannot easily be ignored. Not in a private collection, not in a contested excavation site, but in museum storage rooms and auction house catalogs across Europe and North America. I am referring to the tools. Ancient Egyptian copper chisels and dolerite pounding balls are well documented. They appear in museum collections, They have been tested, and there is broad agreement about what they can and cannot do. Experimental archaeologists have used replicas to work granite and limestone, and the results are instructive. A skilled worker using period-appropriate tools can achieve impressive results over a very long period of time. This is the orthodox explanation for how the pyramids and the Sphinx enclosure were carved. Long timescales, large workforces, primitive tools, extraordinary organization. It is a plausible explanation for much of what we see at Giza. It is not a plausible explanation for all of it. In the collections of the Petrie Museum in London, one of the finest repositories of Egyptian archaeological material in the world, there are artifacts cataloged under the unremarkable label of core drills and saw fragments that tell a different story. In 1983, machinist and researcher Christopher Dunn examined these artifacts and published measurements that have never been formally refuted. The spiral grooves left by an ancient drill bit in a piece of Aswan granite that now sits in the Petrie collection advance at a rate of 0.100 inches per revolution. Modern diamond-tipped drill bits, cutting into the same granite, advance at a rate of 0.0002 inches per revolution. The ancient drill cut 500 times deeper per rotation than our best modern equivalent. Dunn's measurements were taken with calibrated instruments. They appear in his published work in specific, reproducible numbers. Museum curators who were contacted about the artifact labeled it simply as evidence of advanced manual technique. Advanced manual technique. The catalog description sits next to the measurements, and the measurements say something the catalog description does not want to say. In auction records I examined from Sotheby's London from 1923 and again from 1931, I found references to lots described as ancient Egyptian bronze instruments of uncertain purpose, elongated tubular devices with internal threading that no cataloger was able to identify. Both lots sold to private buyers. Neither has surfaced in public collections since. The auction house descriptions include photographs, and in those photographs, the objects are visually consistent with what a machinist would call precision boring equipment. They are not consistent with anything in the standard inventory of ancient Egyptian tools. And suddenly the drill core in the Petrie Museum isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I began this investigation looking at French colonial survey records. I ended at staring at the same question that Edmé-François Jomard was staring at in 1799, standing in the shadow of a monument whose limestone walls were telling him something that the official story had no room for. And I find myself, after all the evidence I have examined, after all the newspaper archives and geological reports and auction catalogs and cartographic records and museum collections, I find myself not with answers, but with questions that I cannot set aside. Why does the water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure correspond to a climate period that ended at least 2,000 years before Khafre was born, and why has this geological evidence never been incorporated into the mainstream timeline? Why do precision construction signatures, specific ratios, specific measurement units, specific geometric relationships between structures and astronomical alignments appear simultaneously and independently on every inhabited continent during the same broad historical window? Why do the records stop? The newspaper investigations, the independent surveys, the heterodox papers in mainstream journals, why do they all stop within a few decades of each other, clustering around 1920, as if a door quietly closed? Why does the largest empire in the 18th century world, an empire documented in encyclopedias and cartographic surveys and diplomatic correspondence, disappear from the historical record with thoroughness that no other civilization of comparable scale has ever matched? Why do the tools in the Petrie Museum tell a story about drilling technology that our own century has not surpassed? And why does the label beside them say nothing about the measurements that anyone with a micrometer can reproduce? Not coincidence. Not random variation. Not independent anomalies. Pattern. The evidence does not point to a mystery that lacks a solution. It points to a solution that powerful institutional forces have determined we are not ready to examine. I don't have definitive answers. Only questions. But the questions are not going away. They are carved into limestone walls that have now stood through at least one catastrophic civilization collapse and are still standing. They are embedded in drill cores in museum storage rooms. They are printed in newspapers that no one reads anymore, in archives that fewer people visit each decade. They are written in the geological language of water erosion on stone that was old when the pharaohs were young. Whatever civilization looked east in the face of the Sphinx when it was new, whatever knowledge they carried, whatever catastrophe consumed them, whatever force has spent 2 centuries arranging the story of the ancient world, so that they do not appear in it, they build in stone, and the stone remains.